The mortuary at night is an unusual place. For most, it would be unsettling, but for me, it has always been a space of order. The still air, the steady hum of fluorescent lights, the sharp scent of disinfectant, all of it brought clarity in a world often marked by chaos. The silence, devoid of conversations or demands, offered me a unique reprieve. The dead were predictable. They didn't judge, didn't linger unnecessarily. They waited. That night began no differently. I had just finished preparing a body for a morning funeral and was tidying up my tools when the phone rang. A family needed their great-grandmother embalmed for a viewing in 2 days. They insisted on bringing her in themselves, declining our usual pickup service. I didn't ask questions. Grief takes people in peculiar directions. The family arrived just after 9 o'clock. The crunch of tires on gravel reached me first, followed by hurried footsteps that broke the stillness outside. When I opened the door, 5 figures greeted me, 3 men and 2 women. They were stiffly dressed in formal yet outdated clothing, like they had stepped out of a time-worn photograph. Their faces were pale, their expressions tight, and their movements deliberate. What caught me off guard wasn't their somber demeanor, but how they brought her in. The great-grandmother wasn't on a stretcher or in a casket. She sat upright in a rocking chair. The chair's wooden frame was dark and polished, its spindles worn smooth from decades of use. She was positioned with her back rigid against the chair, her head tilted slightly to one side, and her eyes wide open. Those eyes, they weren't the empty, glassy orbs of someone deceased. They reflected the light sharply, almost unnervingly, and seemed fixed on something just beyond me. For a fleeting moment, it felt as though she was looking directly at me. One of the men stepped forward and handed me a folded piece of paper. His hands shook as he passed it to me, his voice barely more than a rasp. Her final wishes. I unfolded the note, careful not to smudge its crisp folds. The instructions were brief but strange. Do not close her eyes. Do not move her from the chair. Do not alter her expression. Do not disturb the cloth in her hand. The bottom of the note bore a final line, written in darker, almost frantic handwriting. Failure to respect these traditions will bring grave consequences. I glanced up, expecting an explanation. Instead, I was met with silence. Is there a reason for these specific instructions? I asked, keeping my voice neutral. The eldest woman, her hands weathered and lined with veins, stepped forward. It is her will, she said simply, her tone firm, but edged with something I couldn't quite place. Fear? Devotion? Both? The group didn't linger. After placing the chair in the prep room, they left without another word. Their car's rumble faded into the night, leaving behind a silence that felt heavier than before. I stood there staring at her. The rocking chair, with its aged creaks and dark wood, seemed strangely out of place among the sterile steel tables and white tile floors of the mortuary. Her rigid posture was unsettling, her expression composed but unnatural, and those eyes, unyielding, reflective, felt as though they were waiting. I shook my head, trying to dispel the unease. Strange requests weren't unheard of in my profession. Rituals and family traditions often surfaced in the wake of loss. I folded the note neatly and placed it on my desk before turning back to her. "All right, ma'am," I murmured under my breath, more to myself than to her. "Let's get started." I wheeled the rocking chair carefully into the prep room, the sound of its casters clunking unevenly over the tiles. The mortuary lights buzzed faintly overhead, casting stark shadows on the walls, and the air felt sharper than usual. The chair didn't belong here. It was a relic in a room of stainless steel and precision instruments. Yet here it was, carrying her like a relic of some bygone ritual. The note sat on the counter beside me, its instructions etched into my mind as if I'd read them 100 times. Each word carried an unsettling weight. Do not close her eyes. Do not move her from the chair. Do not alter her expression. Do not disturb the cloth in her hand. It felt less like guidance and more like a warning. Her eyes were the hardest to ignore. They remained fixed in their wide, unblinking stare, almost daring me to look closer. It wasn't unusual for the deceased to retain some intensity in their features, but hers felt calculated. They reflected the overhead light in a way that seemed alive, yet impossibly still. I avoided looking at them directly, but they always seemed to find me in my peripheral vision. I tried to focus on my preparations. I arranged my tools in neat rows and double-checked the embalming fluids. Everything about this task felt different, not because of the process itself, but because of her presence. The creak of the rocking chair broke the rhythm of my movements. It was soft and rhythmic, but in the silence of the room, it felt amplified. "It's just the weight shifting," I muttered, though my voice sounded hollow in the sterile space. Still, I couldn't stop myself from glancing over my shoulder. The family's requests created challenges I hadn't encountered before. Embalming a body in a seated position was far from standard. The mortuary table, with its restraints and drains, wasn't designed for something like this, yet I found myself adapting. After all, I had seen stranger requests over the years. This was simply another. Her skin was pale and waxy, cold to the touch, a standard condition for someone who had been dead for over a day. As I inspected her hands, my eyes fell on the cloth she held. Tucked tightly into her fingers, it appeared old and worn, its edges frayed. Dark stains dotted the fabric. Perhaps ink, oil, or something more organic. I leaned closer, careful not to disturb it. The family's note echoed in my mind. "Do not disturb the cloth." I turned back to the embalming process, trying to keep my thoughts grounded in routine. When I inserted the trocar, a hollow needle used to drain fluids, I immediately encountered resistance. Her veins felt tough, almost rubbery, as though something within them refused to give. I adjusted my angle and applied more pressure, but the process remained slow and tedious. My first thought was that it might be due to her age. Older bodies often pose challenges, calcified veins, brittle skin, but this was different. It felt unnatural. I glanced at her face again. Her expression hadn't changed, yet it felt different. The serene calm of her features held a weight that made my stomach knot. I adjusted the pump, muttering under my breath to break the oppressive silence. The rocking chair creaked again. This time I froze. My hand hovered over the embalming pump as I slowly turned my head. The chair remained perfectly still, its wooden frame unyielding. The sound couldn't have come from anywhere else, but the room offered no explanation. I stood there for a long moment, my pulse steady but loud in my ears. "It's just a chair," I said aloud, hoping the sound of my own voice would ground me. But the tension in the room remained, clinging to me like a second skin. Forcing myself to continue, I resumed the embalming process. The minutes dragged on, each step feeling heavier than usual. The embalming fluid finally began to flow, but sluggishly, as though something within her resisted. I adjusted the settings on the pump, but the sluggish flow persisted. "Come on," I muttered, leaning closer to inspect the equipment. Everything appeared to be functioning normally. It wasn't the machine, it wasn't the chemicals, it was her. The chair creaked once more, louder and sharper than before. My chest tightened as I straightened up, my eyes fixed on the body. Her gaze, wide and unblinking, felt as though it was meeting mine. I took a step back, breathing deeply to steady myself. "It's just a chair," I repeated. But even as I tried to focus on my work, I couldn't shake the sense that I wasn't alone in the room. The prep room felt suffocating as I continued the embalming. The air pressed against my skin like a damp cloth, and every sound, the hum of the lights, the faint whir of the embalming pump, seemed louder than it should have been. I focused on the task, letting the repetition of precise movements guide me back to a sense of control. The embalming fluid finally began to flow more smoothly. I adjusted the pump to monitor the pressure, watching as the liquid disappeared into her veins. My hands moved with practiced steadiness, but my thoughts remained unmoored, tethered only by the note's rigid instructions. Do not close her eyes. Do not move her from the chair. Do not alter her expression. Do not disturb the cloth in her hand. Her face was unsettlingly composed, serene even. But her wide-open eyes were a sharp contrast, as if defying that calm with something unsaid. They seemed to catch the light in ways that made them feel disturbingly present. I avoided looking at them for long. They drew my attention too easily, making it hard to focus. When I reached her hands, I noticed the cloth again. Its edges were worn, the material thin and dotted with dark stains that refused to fade under the harsh, fluorescent lights. It wasn't blood or anything I could immediately identify. Whatever had seeped into the fibers seemed older than the fabric itself. Her fingers curled tightly around it, clutching it as though it were a part of her. I wiped the area carefully, unwilling to disturb the cloth despite my curiosity. The chair emitted a soft groan as I shifted my position. My rational mind blamed it on the uneven tiles beneath the casters. But there was something about the sound, how it carried and seemed to linger, that felt unnatural in the sterile silence of the room. Returning to the embalming process, I picked up a scalpel to make a small incision for the trocar. The blade glinted under the overhead lights, and I hesitated for a moment, holding it above her skin. I couldn't pinpoint why, but I felt an overwhelming hesitation, as though this small act was more significant than it should have been. When I finally pressed forward, the skin resisted slightly. It wasn't the brittleness I was used to with older bodies, nor was it the calcification of veins that sometimes occurred. It was something else, something I couldn't explain. As the scalpel broke the surface, a dark, viscous substance oozed out. It wasn't blood. It wasn't embalming fluid. The substance was thick and glossy, catching the light like oil on water. Its scent was faint but sharp, metallic with an undertone that reminded me of damp earth. I instinctively stepped back, the scalpel still in my hand as the smell settled in the room. Forcing myself to continue, I cleaned the area quickly, my movements becoming more deliberate. The antiseptic scent of the room should have masked everything, but the sharp tang of that dark fluid lingered, as though it had rooted itself in the air. As I worked, I noticed something tucked into the folds of her shawl. It was a photograph, old and faded, its edges worn from years of handling. I hesitated before picking it up, holding it delicately between gloved fingers. The image showed her seated in the same rocking chair, surrounded by younger family members. Their faces were solemn, their postures unnaturally rigid, as though they were participating in something they didn't fully understand. One figure stood apart from the rest, their body angled slightly away, their expression unreadable. On the back of the photograph, faint handwriting stretched across the paper. The ink was faded, but still legible. Honor her wishes. The words lingered in my mind as I returned the photograph to its place. My hands trembled slightly as I tucked it back into the shawl, careful not to disturb her grip on the cloth. The chair groaned again. The sound wasn't sharp or sudden. It was slow, deliberate, like something shifting gradually. I froze, my hands still hovering over the table. My eyes flicked to the chair's base, scanning the floor for any sign of movement. Nothing. The chair sat as it had before, its shadow cast long and crooked against the tiled wall. I turned back to her face, avoiding her eyes as I steadied my breathing. Whatever was happening, it wasn't something I could explain. Not yet. I returned to my tools, focusing on the next step, but my senses stayed alert, tuned to every sound, every shift in the room. The prep room, once a sanctuary of calm and precision, now felt oppressive. Even the steady hum of the lights seemed more intrusive, their flickering edges gnawing at my nerves. And as I continued my work, I couldn't escape the feeling that I was being watched, not by her eyes, but by something far more intangible. The room seemed heavier as I worked, its familiar sterility now carrying a weight I couldn't place. Each sound, the hum of the pump, the scrape of tools against the tray, felt sharper, like it wasn't just noise, but something pressing against the edges of the silence. I avoided looking at her face directly, letting the routine of my task guide me forward. As I cleaned her features, I noticed again how lifelike they seemed. Her skin was pale but smooth, the faint lines around her mouth giving the impression of someone who'd spent much of their life in quiet thought. Her expression was so composed it felt deliberate, like she had chosen to hold it even in death. Her lips were just parted enough to hint at speech left unfinished. Her hands, still gripping the cloth, caught my attention again. The fabric looked thinner now under the bright, fluorescent lights, its edges frayed to near translucency. The stains were darker, their glossy surface reflecting the light like dried lacquer. I leaned in slightly, angling the flashlight for a closer look. The patterns weren't random. They formed uneven lines and curves, almost like symbols etched into the fibers. But I couldn't be sure. I pulled back, unwilling to linger too long. The family's instructions repeated in my head, a steady pulse against my thoughts. Do not disturb the cloth. I turned back to the embalming tools, resetting my focus. The trocar moved steadily, and I watched as the pump worked to drain the fluids. The process should have been straightforward, but something about it felt wrong. The tubing seemed slower, the flow irregular, as though the body itself resisted. Then I noticed it again. The viscous, dark liquid from before began pooling at the edges of the incision. It wasn't blood or embalming fluid. Its texture and smell were all wrong. The faint metallic tang had a sharper undertone now, lingering in the air like damp iron. I wiped the area clean, but the substance clung stubbornly to the cloth, refusing to be absorbed. I paused, my hand still holding the cloth, and glanced toward the rocking chair. The air seemed to shift as the chair groaned softly, the sound carrying through the room like a low murmur. It wasn't sharp or sudden, it was steady, almost patient, as though waiting for acknowledgement. I set the cloth aside, turning fully to face the chair. Its worn spindles and polished armrests seemed to gleam faintly under the harsh lighting. It sat unmoving, yet its presence felt magnified, filling more space than it should. I forced myself to turn back to her, focusing on the next step. The chair emitted another sound, but this time it wasn't a groan. It was a faint, rhythmic creak, like the subtle shift of weight. The noise didn't fade, it lingered, an uneven pattern that seemed to fill every corner of the room. My fingers froze mid-motion as I turned my gaze toward it again. The chair hadn't moved, but its presence seemed louder now, an object that demanded attention without action. I swallowed hard, returning my focus to the tools. My hands moved with mechanical precision, though my mind wandered dangerously close to panic. Her face caught my attention again as I turned to check the incision. Her lips had parted slightly wider, her expression softening just enough to seem different. I hesitated, staring at her features, waiting for something to shift. Nothing did. I leaned back against the counter, gripping its edge tightly. "I'm imagining things," I whispered, though my voice felt too small for the room. The fluorescent lights flickered, their hum wavering momentarily before stabilizing. I turned away from her face, busying myself with the cleanup. The weight in the room remained, pressing against my chest with every movement. The shadows on the wall stretched longer than they should have, their edges sharp under the harsh light. As I moved toward the workstation, I glanced back at the rocking chair one last time. Its frame sat motionless, but its presence lingered, as though the sound of its creak hadn't quite left the room. The embalming process neared its conclusion, but the tension in the room only deepened. Each movement I made felt heavier, each sound sharper, as though the space itself had turned against me. I kept my hands moving methodically, clinging to the routine like a lifeline. Her face remained unchanged, or so I told myself. But every time I glanced up, something about it seemed to shift. The subtle curve of her lips, the set of her jaw, the wide-open eyes, it all felt too lifelike, as if she were caught between here and someplace I couldn't understand. The cloth in her hand seemed looser now, its edges slightly unfurled. I hadn't touched it, and yet it appeared as though it had moved. The faint markings I'd noticed earlier were more visible now, dark lines forming shapes that refused to make sense. They weren't random, they were purposeful, intentional. I leaned closer, the urge to see them more clearly gnawing at me. The stains caught the light again, their texture glossy and uneven. Whatever they were, they felt old, older than the fabric, older than anything I could place. The chair groaned softly behind me, interrupting my thoughts. I froze, my fingers still gripping the scalpel. The sound didn't stop immediately. It dragged on, a slow creak, like a rope pulling taut. I turned to look, my breath shallow. The rocking chair was still, its shadow stretched across the tiled floor, unmoving, and yet somehow overwhelming. The air around it felt heavier, thick with something I couldn't name. I turned back to the workstation, trying to steady myself. As I wiped down my tools, my eyes darted to the photograph tucked back into a shawl. I couldn't help myself. I reached for it again, holding it closer under the light. The faces stared back at me, their expressions even stiffer now, as though the photo itself had shifted in some subtle way. The figure I'd noticed before, and the one turned slightly away, seemed even more distant. Their face was just blurry enough to make their features unrecognizable, but their posture told a story of reluctance. Whatever this family had done, or refused to do, it was captured here in this moment, preserved like the body before me. The words on the back echoed in my mind. Honor her wishes. I placed the photograph back carefully, ensuring it fit just as it had before. My fingers trembled as I pulled away from the shawl, unwilling to disturb her further. The chair groaned again, but this time, the sound didn't feel random. It had a rhythm to it, like the start of a slow, unsteady motion. I turned sharply, my eyes locking on the frame. The chair had shifted forward, its backrest tilted ever so slightly. My pulse pounded in my temples as I stared, waiting for it to stop. When it finally settled, the room fell silent again, but the quiet felt alive, like it was waiting for something to happen. I returned to the body, my movements quicker. I just want to be done with this damn thing already. My hands moved automatically, cleaning and arranging the tools while avoiding her gaze. But the weight of her eyes pressed against me, pulling in my attention no matter how hard I tried to ignore it. The fluorescent lights flickered again, their faint buzz cutting through the silence. Shadows stretched across the walls in unnatural shapes, bending and twisting with the light. I wiped my brow, the dampness of sweat unfamiliar in the chill of the mortuary. The embalming fluid had finally run its course, and I stepped back, glancing over her one last time. Her features were unchanged, and yet they weren't. It was impossible to explain, but something about her presence had shifted. I reached for the checklist, eager to complete the final details. My pen hovered over the paper, but the words blurred together. I blinked hard, trying to focus, but the sound of the chair creaking again broke my concentration. This time, the sound was unmistakable. The chair rocked slightly, its legs pressing unevenly against the tiles with a low, dragging scrape. My stomach knotted as I watched it move, the motion so slight, yet undeniably real. I stepped back, the edge of the workstation pressing against my spine. The chair stilled once more, its frame leaning forward as though it were observing me. I couldn't stay in the room any longer. My task was finished, and yet I felt no relief. The mortuary, which had always been a place of comfort and control, now felt like a trap. The air was too thick, and the silence too loud. Without looking back, I turned off the pump and gathered my tools. The checklist remained unfinished, but I didn't care. My only thought was to leave the room, to leave her. I spent longer than usual cleaning up the workstation, trying to steady my hands and focus on the mechanical rhythm of the task. Even the sound of running water from the sink seemed to mock the silence that pressed against me. The checklist sat unfinished on the counter, and for the first time, I didn't care. The knock at the mortuary door startled me, breaking through the stillness with a sharpness that set my teeth on edge. I glanced at the clock. Just past midnight. The family was back earlier than I had expected. Their arrival wasn't accompanied by conversation or pleasantries. When I opened the door, the 5 of them stood in a close formation under the dim porch light. The eldest woman was at the center, her presence as commanding as it had been earlier, though her face betrayed no emotion. "Is everything ready?" she asked. Her voice was steady, calm, yet it carried a weight that made me hesitate before answering. "Yes," I replied, my throat dry. "Everything was done exactly as you requested." She nodded once, a faint gesture that felt more like a formality than approval. Without another word, the group stepped past me, moving with the same quiet, purposeful steps they had when they arrived. They headed directly to the prep room. I followed a few paces behind, reluctant to interrupt the silence they carried with them. When they reached the rocking chair, one of the younger men stepped forward, running his hands over the coffin I had prepared. His fingers traced its edges, moving as if searching for imperfections. After a moment, he gave a slight nod to the others. The eldest woman approached the coffin next, leaning in to inspect its polished surface. Her hands, wrinkled and weathered, moved deliberately, ensuring that everything was as it should be. Satisfied, she stepped back and turned to me. "You have honored her wishes," she said. The words were polite, but they carried an undercurrent of something I couldn't quite name. Relief, perhaps, or something closer to warning. "We appreciate your respect." I opened my mouth to respond, but before I could, they moved to lift the coffin. Each family member took a corner, their motions practiced and synchronized, as though they had done this before. They carried the weight with ease, wheeling it toward the hallway. As they reached the door, the eldest woman stopped and turned back to me. Her expression was unreadable, but her eyes held mine with an intensity that rooted me in place. "Do not speak of this to anyone," she said. "For your own sake." Her voice lingered in the air long after the door closed behind them. The sound of their footsteps faded into the night, leaving the mortuary in a silence so deep it felt suffocating. I remained in the hallway for a long time, staring at the empty space where the rocking chair had been. The prep room felt impossibly still now, its sterility overwhelming. I should have felt relief that the night was over, that I had fulfilled their peculiar requests without incident. But instead I felt hollow. I returned to the workstation, my gaze landing on the checklist I had left unfinished. Beside it, the family's note lay folded, exactly where I had placed it earlier. My stomach tightened as I picked it up, certain I had handed it back with the rest of their paperwork. Yet here it was. Unfolding the paper, I scanned the instructions again, each line now seared into my memory. Do not close her eyes. Do not move her from the chair. Do not alter her expression. Do not disturb the cloth in her hand. At the bottom, where the final warning had been, a new line had been added in the same jagged handwriting. Thank you for your respect. Do not forget. The ink was fresh, its strokes sharp against the page. My hands shook as I folded the note back into a neat square and set it down. The air around me felt colder, heavier, pressing against my chest as though the room itself had turned on me. I forced myself to finish cleaning, my movements mechanical and brisk. My usual routine, so practiced and predictable, felt foreign now, as though I were an outsider in my own space. When I finally turned out the lights and locked the door behind me, the night air was no reprieve. The cool breeze that met me felt thick and cloying, like it carried something unseen. I hurried to my car, locking the doors as soon as I slid into the driver's seat. The rumble of the engine should have been grounding, but the silence that followed felt even louder. The drive home felt longer than usual, though the streets were empty and the lights turned green in my favor. The car's engine hummed steadily, a sound that should have been comforting, but it wasn't. I kept glancing at the rearview mirror, my eyes darting to the empty back seat. It was irrational, but I couldn't shake the sensation that I wasn't alone. When I pulled into my driveway, I sat in the car for a moment, staring at the dark outline of my house. The warm glow of the porch light was supposed to feel inviting, but tonight it seemed distant, like it belonged to someone else. I stepped out quickly, fumbling with my keys as I reached the door. Once inside, I locked the door behind me and checked it twice, something I hadn't done in years. The house was silent except for the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. Normally, I would have poured myself a drink or turned on the TV for some background noise, but tonight, I just stood there, staring into the empty living room. The mortuary had never followed me home before. Its silence and stillness were supposed to stay there, locked behind heavy doors. But tonight, it clung to me like a second skin. Sleep didn't come easily. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, every creak of the house amplified in the quiet. My mind replayed the night in excruciating detail, the rocking chair, the photograph, the note with its fresh ink. I told myself it was over, that the family had taken her and the strange events of the evening were behind me, but I couldn't convince myself. The next morning, I stumbled into the kitchen, still wearing the clothes from the night before. The coffee pot sat untouched, as I tried to piece together a sense of normalcy. That's when I noticed the envelope on the floor near the front door. It was plain, unmarked, with no postage or return address. My heart sank as I picked it up. The paper felt rough, its edges uneven, like it had been folded hastily. I tore it open, the contents spilling into my hands. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a crude drawing of the rocking chair. Above it, two eyes stared out, wide and sharp, as if watching me. The lines of the drawing were jagged, the ink uneven, as though it had been drawn in a rush. My stomach turned as I held it up to the light, searching for some clue as to who had left it, or why. The back of the paper bore another message, written in the same frantic handwriting. Do not forget. I dropped the paper onto the counter, backing away as though it might come to life. The room seemed smaller suddenly, its walls closing in around me. I double-checked the locks on the doors and windows, my hands trembling as I tested each one. I didn't go back to the mortuary that night. Instead, I called the funeral home's client coordinator and requested a shift change, citing personal reasons. I didn't offer details, and thankfully, they didn't ask for any. Over the next few weeks, I withdrew from everything. I avoided the mortuary as much as possible, taking on only daytime tasks and leaving as soon as I was done. I blocked the family's number and email, ensuring they could never contact me again. Yet even with those boundaries in place, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. At night, the smallest sound set me on edge. The creak of the house settling, the rustle of leaves against the window. All of it felt charged, like it carried more meaning than it should. I started sleeping with the lights on, though sleep itself rarely came. The rocking chair haunted me most. I saw it in the edges of my mind, swaying faintly, its frame groaning softly against the weight of something unseen. And always her eyes lingered in my thoughts, sharp, unyielding, and impossible to escape. Eventually, I began considering leaving the mortuary altogether. The place that had once been a sanctuary now felt like a prison. Each time I stepped inside, I felt the same suffocating weight, the same sense that I was no longer in control. But starting over felt daunting, so I stayed, carving out strict boundaries. No peculiar cases, no late-night shifts. The memory of that night stayed with me, slipping into the quiet corners of my mind when I least expected it. It wasn't always there, but in the still moments, it would surface. Sometimes, in the dead of night, I could almost hear it. The damn cursed rocking chair creaking in my thoughts and ears. Other nights I dream of her unblinking face, those eyes that seem to see too much. I tell myself it's over, that I'll never have to face anything like that again. But deep down, I can't help but wonder if I'm only trying to convince myself.